Founded in 1999, BGI Group, formerly known as the Beijing Genomics Institute, is a multi-billion-dollar Chinese biotech conglomerate based in Shenzhen, China, and according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is the largest genetic research organization in the world and happens to be the manufacturer of the 10 million PCR tests, which make up the majority of tests in Australia, but are mostly being used in Victoria. BGI refers to itself on its About Us page as the, quote, world's leading provider of genomic sequencing services, and has a focus on areas such as clinical research in human health, drug development, genomic sequencing, and medical testing. Here's some additional information. BGI has 6,000 staff employed all around the world and has operations in over 100 countries, including a headquarters located in Brisbane. Since the inception of the COVID crisis, BGI has sold PCR tests to 180 countries and counting, and has set up 58 BGI equipment-equipped labs, 11 of which have been established in Australia, with multiple located in Victoria. In fact, just like Fortescue Metals, BGI recorded its record profit this year. In 2017, BGI went public on the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, raising $81 million in their initial public offering. In May earlier this year, BGI raised more than $1 billion for its subsidiary MGI from investors including IDG Capital and CITIC Private Equity. Now, it's interesting to point out that CITIC Private Equity is a subsidiary of CITIC Group, a Chinese state-run investment firm that has deep business interests in the Western Australian iron ore industry. Now, BGI claims to not be associated with the Chinese government and told Axio back in June that, quote, BGI is an independent company owned by shareholders and employees. It is not owned or controlled by the government. But here's the truth. BGI has demonstrated over the years that they are absolutely in cooperation and in collaboration with the Chinese government. Here's a few examples. A, BGI was founded with government support in 1999. B, BGI runs the Chinese Communist Party's National Gene Bank, which is a massive government-owned facility for the purpose of storing DNA. C, BGI received a $1.5 billion loan in 2010 from a Chinese state development bank. D, BGI's researchers have collaborated with the Chinese military. E, BGI joined the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative and now has access to the same Chinese state-run commercial lending institutions as do other Belt and Road organizations. It's important to note that under Daniel Andrews, Victoria was the only state to sign up to the Belt and Road Initiative. And D, BGI is at the forefront of the Chinese Communist Party's Made in China 2025 program, which is Beijing's plan to dominate global emerging markets, including but not limited to biotech, pharmaceuticals, and medical infrastructure. Here's some other bits and pieces. Here's a photo of the BGI team proudly raising the BGI flag in front of Melbourne Pathology. That looks to me somewhat as a symbolic gesture of conquest in a way. In 2015, BGI provoked controversy and concerns from animal welfare organizations after attempting to commercialize genetically modified animals such as micro pigs as pets. In 2015, BGI broke the sacred medical code when it published the private information of more than 10,000 of its female patients via the online journal nature.com. Last December, BGI told Bloomberg of its plan involving newborn babies and said, quote, BGI has proposed a plan to sequence the genome of every baby born in Shenzhen. Now, this strikes an eerie parallel to a Facebook post made by Daniel Andrews in 2017, where he stated, quote, every baby born in 2020 and 2021 will be invited to be part of the biggest clinical study in history. BGI is currently being sued by the US-based genomic sequencing company Illumina for alleged intellectual property theft of multiple patents. But perhaps most concerningly of them all is BGI's apparent links to the most terrible crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as a, quote, deliberate act, typically as part of a systemic campaign that causes human suffering or death on a large scale. So we're talking about crimes such as large-scale enslavement, rape, torture, and murder, all of which the Chinese people have been routinely subjected to under the iron fist rule of the Chinese Communist Party for over 70 years. But over time, as technology has evolved, so has the manner in which the Chinese Communist Party carries out these crimes. In recent years, Chinese biotech companies such as Bgi and others, which are ultimately controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, have been accused of committing crimes against innocent citizens, including, but not limited to, the unlawful large-scale collection of DNA samples, forced medical testing, and in March this year, the independent China tribunal passed down its full judgment and proved beyond reasonable doubt that forced human organ harvesting is being carried out by the CCP in collaboration with Chinese corporations. I'm going to read a passage from page 150 of the 562-page report that was published by the China Tribunal in March. It said, "There has been a population of donors accessible to hospitals in the People's Republic of China whose organs could be extracted according to demand, and this has coincided with the long-term practice in the People's Republic of China of forced organ harvesting, and with many Falun Gong practitioners, along with Uyghurs, being compelled to have medical tests forced on their organs." The tribunal's findings were so substantial that several countries around the world actually banned their citizens from traveling to China for organ transplants. Some of the countries were Israel, Italy, Taiwan, and Spain, and I think Australia should do the same. So here's the situation. Bgi is implicated in these crimes. Here's what people are saying. In 2017, Human Rights Watch raised concerns over DNA harvesting in China, which was being carried out under the false pretense of free medical testing. And in July 2020, Human Rights Watch's senior China researcher Maya Wang told The Guardian that her organization was concerned about, quote, the large amount of sensitive personal data Bgi was collecting both in China and globally. She went on to say, "We are also concerned about its reported close ties to the Chinese government, which has spent enormous efforts to amass people's data for mass surveillance and behavioral engineering purposes." Earlier this year, the United States Commerce Department added 11 Chinese companies to an economic blacklist over concerns they were participating in human rights abuses, including mass arbitrary detention and forced DNA collection against the Uyghur Muslim minority in the Xinjiang province. 2 out of those 11 companies were direct subsidiaries of Bgi, the Xinjiang Silk Road Bgi and the Beijing Luhe Bgi. The Commerce Department said that these organizations were conducting genetic analysis used to further the repression of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities, and that Beijing actively promotes the reprehensible practice of forced labor and abusive DNA collection and analysis schemes to repress its citizens. Our very own experts at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute have studied and reported on DNA harvesting in China for a long time now. An article written on the 17th of June 2020 titled Genomic Surveillance by Emil Dirks and Dr. James Leibold said, "The Chinese government is building the world's largest police-run DNA database in close cooperation with key industry partners across the globe," and went on to say, "Since 2013, Chinese authorities have collected DNA samples from entire ethnic minority communities and ordinary citizens outside any criminal investigation and without proper informed consent. The Chinese government's genomic dataset likely contains more than 100 million profiles and possibly as many as 140 million, making it the world's largest DNA database." The article went on to name Chinese corporations involved, one of them being a Bgi subsidiary, once again, called Forensic Genomics. So here's how I see it. In order for forced organ harvesting to be carried out, there must be an on-hand database of human DNA profiles in order to match buyers with organ harvesting victims. And considering that Bgi specializes in managing gene banks, as well as their close cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party, I personally consider it incomprehensible that Bgi is not involved in these crimes, and that Australia should not support BGI in any way, shape, or form for moral reasons, and to also safeguard Australian citizens from future activity. Another widely shared concern is that the CCP might be stealing genetic information on Australian citizens via backdoor access to BGI equipment. You see, the CCP is notorious for cyber theft and has an entire division of their military dedicated to the cause. In fact, earlier this year, the Australian government detected a large-scale cyber assault on our military. But nonetheless, the government and Health Minister Greg Hunt were quick to dismiss these concerns. But not so quickly. Unfortunately for Australia, the government did not explain to the public the measures it took to clear BGI equipment. And due to a special exemption from the Department of Health, all BGI equipment was able to be approved for use by the Therapeutic Goods Administration without typical scrutiny. It's also important to note that several nations have experienced data theft via Chinese-built technology. For example, it took the officials in Africa 5 years to realize their union headquarters, which was built by China, had been compromised by Beijing the entire time. Many experts from various countries, including here in Australia, have shared concerns that BGI could be doing the same thing. Here's what they're saying. In April 2020, Israel's biggest healthcare provider, Khalid, made the decision not to work with BGI out of security concerns. An article from the Times of Israel stated that, quote, Khalid CEO Johanan Locker made the decision over concerns BGI and the Chinese government could gain access to sensitive information on its 4.9 million customers, including on their DNA. Bob Kocher, a California-based physician and coronavirus testing task force volunteer, expressed concerns regarding BGI's aggressive business model and that China might gain access to patient data via BGI equipment. Subsequently, the state of California officially decided to ban the use of BGI. Earlier this year, the US National Counterintelligence and Security Center drew parallels between BGI and Chinese tech giant Huawei and warned that BGI could likely be used by the CCP to capture and exploit patient data. In a report published in the US Office of Director of National Intelligence by Science and Medical Experts, additional concerns were raised that citizen DNA information could be weaponized if captured by a hostile actor, potentially resulting in the targeting of individuals for surveillance, extortion or manipulation, as well as gaining a market advantage over the United States. In October 2020, the US Department of Homeland Security and State Department applied pressure on the Nevada state government to not use 250,000 donated BGI tests, once again out of concerns of patient data theft. An article published by the Associated Press on the 15th of October said, the warnings from the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department led the Office of Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak in April to direct a Nevada hospital not to use any of the donated 250,000 test kits as officials turned down an offered laboratory deal. In Hong Kong, and despite having very few reported COVID cases, the Hong Kong government has partnered with BGI in a radical plan to test upwards of 50% of the 7.5 million population. This has sparked major concerns from lawmakers, independent media, and activists who fear the CCP could be harvesting their DNA for abusive purposes, similar to the crimes against humanity which are currently being carried out in China. Australia's Professor James Leibold, who is a senior fellow from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and is somebody who specialises in the study of CCP DNA surveillance in China, he also expressed concerns. This is what he had to say on BGI on Sky News.
I don't know that I like the look of a Chinese bio company deep in genomics and the use of DNA being the body that has these tests and these machines that we're paying all this money to import into Australia, and your concerns and my concerns are shared.
Yeah, well, Peter, I think I come from the perspective of would I be willing to rock up to one of these testing sites and have my biometric samples taken How do I know it's not going to end up in Beijing in some, police-linked database? But I also come at it from over 20 years of studying Chinese politics as well as Chinese control and surveillance mechanisms. And really, my concerns are kind of twofold. As you pointed out, issues around privacy protection, what's going to happen to that data that is collected, how will it be stored, will it be transferred? How do we know it's not going to be, end up, as I said, back in Beijing somewhere? But also, I come at it from a kind of ethical issue as well. Two of those companies involved in providing those test kits, Beijing Genomic Institute as well as Thermo Fisher Scientifica, have been linked to serious human rights abuses in China's western region of Xinjiang. And we had to ask about those companies, and are we willing to collaborate with them here in Australia? Are there concerns that they might not be worthy partners